Okay, welcome back everybody. Now, because I want to announce our next panel or dialogue maybe, I'm very happy and it's a real honor to introduce Shona Illingworth and Downey. So, it's a conversation, and they both made a strong point, it's a conversation where the works of the both of them are speaking to each other. And now I introduce Shona Illingworth. She's and maybe I need my glasses, otherwise it will not work, an artist and a professor of art, film and media at the University of Kent. She's a Danish-Scottish artist and a professor of art, film and media, I said that before. Her work examines the impact of accelerating military, industrial and environmental transformations of airspace and outer space and the implications for human rights. She is the co-founder with Nick Grief of the Airspace Tribunal, and actually I had the pleasure to learn to know Shona. She did like 3 airspace tribunals, 4, oh my God, in Toronto, Sydney, London and Berlin, and I was happy to be part of the Berlin Tribunal in 2021. That's when I learned about this amazing work. And Shona also, she does a lot of solo exhibitions in very impressive places, I have to say. For example, at the, and I'm very bad in French, the Les Abattoirs Musée in Toulouse, the Power Plant in Toronto, the Bahrain National Museum. She is an Imperial War Museum associate and sits on different international editorial boards, for example, of the journal Digital War, where she did only recently edited, I think together with Anthony, an impressive special issue on these airspace tribunals I can highly recommend. What else? And she did, and I forgot to bring it because it's a very beautiful book which was edited by Anthony Downey. It's called Topologies of Air, published by Sternberg Press and the Power Plant. Anthony Downey, he's a professor of visual culture in the Middle East and North Africa at Birmingham City University. He sits on the editorial boards of Third Text, Digital War, and Memory, Mind, and Media. And as I said, he edits very beautiful books like The Topologies of Air, but also books like Decolonizing Vision, Algorithmic Anxieties, and the Future of Warfare, which will come up next year. And he did Trevor Paglin's book on adversarial evolved hallucinations. He conducts also a 4-year project to support cultural practices and educational provision for children with disabilities in the Lebanon, the occupied Palestinian territories, and Jordan. And as I said, they will speak to each other's works. They will explore how we deploy creative practices to critically address the fatal interlocking of global surveillance technologies, neo-colonial expansionism, environmental degradation, and the lethal threat of drone warfare. So, welcome, Shona and Anthony. I'm very much looking forward to your contribution.
First of all, I would like to thank Jutta and Tatiana for inviting us to speak here, and to all of you for being here and online. Before discussing the Airspace Tribunal that Jutta mentioned and the large related body of work that I've made called Topologies of Air, I'd like to begin here on the northwest corner of Scotland in the 1970s. And I want to do this in order to begin to focus on the oppressive experience of having the sky over your head transformed from a place of endless space and wonder into a source of overwhelming fear, anxiety, and death. So I grew up on the edge of the Cape Wrath Range, which is a live bombardment range in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland, and it's where NATO joint warrior military exercises involving land, air, and sea forces of up to 20 countries at a time turn the place into a proxy landscape for war in other parts of the world. So as a child, GR4 Tornado jets would suddenly appear in the sky, flying very, very low, to drop 1,000-pound live bombs just off the coast. And the experience was that the sky would instantly collapse into an oppressive lid over our heads, and the sonic force in our bodies was absolutely visceral. And our spatial world would contract with the overpowering military presence and command above. And some years later, when I was filming in the range control tower, the forward air controller there called in 3 GR4 Tornado jets for what's called a show of force. And a show of force is when jets fly very, very low to the ground, and it's used to terrify and disperse civilians. I didn't know that we were the target of this exercise, and the sonic impact was absolutely terrifying. And even though I knew that I wasn't a target, I knew that the force wasn't hostile, and that the event was temporary, I wasn't able to sleep for 48 hours because my body couldn't rest. So I ask us to consider both the cultural, social, and environmental importance of our skies and its role in many different cultures and cosmologies, and the devastating experience and consequences of being subjected to unrelenting aerial violence and existential threat from above. Modernity's representation of the sky as open and empty, I would argue, performs acts of cultural erasure that support the military's expanding abstraction and instrumentalization of airspace and now increasingly outer space. This is an earlier body of work called Lesions in the Landscape that explores the future consequences of amnesia and cultural erasure in the context of colonialism, military expansion, and marginalization. What you see here are the images of the St Kilda Islands off the northwest corner of Scotland, which were inhabited for over 4,000 years. They're also the site of a radar station for complex weapons testing range. And that's something it's an island that is a conservation space, so it has 2 UNESCO World Heritage statuses, one for environment and one for marine ecology, actually, and one for culture. But the presence of this military range is very much kept out of that narrative. And Kinetic, who managed the weapons testing range for the use of military and arms manufacturers, describe the space as a sanitized airspace of unlimited altitude. So the human assault on our atmosphere, on our skies, on our airspace and outer space is complex, multiple, and accelerating. It is corporate, military, industrial, chemical, environmental, psychological, and existential. And the intersection between these assaults is compounding, resulting in catastrophic loss of biodiversity, expanding militarism and multi-domain war, intensification of conflicts due to climate change, and mass forced migration. Human rights lawyer Conor Geraghty describes human rights as a project of making the invisible visible. And the Airspace Tribunal that we set up in 2018, a major project of the Airspace Tribunal is making the civilian harms, the harms to people and environments, visible, understandable, and legible. So established legal frameworks that define the established legal frameworks define airspace into territorial zones. So this is an image of an imagined state, and the space you see above it is the sovereign airspace. The legal framework for airspace was established in the 1940s and for outer space in the 1960s. And they do not account for the scale, reach, proliferation, and compounding impacts of current accelerating and emerging threats from above. And one area that urgently requires development is the human rights dimension of airspace and outer space. So in 2018, I established the airspace, as Utam said, with human rights lawyer Nick Grief. And this is an international people's tribunal which brought together a diverse range of knowledge and lived experience to consider the proliferating threats from airspace and outer space, and to examine the case for a proposed new human right to live without physical or psychological threat from above. Kirsty Brimelow was KC, a very well-known international human rights lawyer in the UK, was our principal counsel to the tribunal. And she asked each speaker who gave evidence questions and facilitated questions from the public, who were the tribunal's judges. And the hearings were recorded and transcribed to form the drafting history of the proposed new human right, and through that process, the Airspace Tribunal challenges the traditional state-centric view of how international law is created. So we held hearings the first hearing was at Doughty Street Chambers, which is a barrister's chambers in London, and then at the Ethics Centre in Sydney, the power plant in Toronto, and the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights in Berlin, where we heard fantastic evidence in all of these, but I should mention that Lisa Ling gave really important evidence at the tribunal hearing in Berlin, and as did Jutta, and as did Andreas Schuller and many others. And also Anthony gave evidence in Toronto. So people, just to give you an idea of the kinds of things people talked about, people gave evidence on the weaponization of the weather, the global governance issues of proposed large-scale geoengineering projects, the intersection of contemporary global slavery and ecocide, information totalitarianism, surveillance, the use of patterns of life data in predictive targeting, the devastating abstraction of civilian deaths as data for research into aerial bombardment and the development of new technologies of warfare, the use of conflict as experimental laboratories for the development of so-called battle-ready weapon systems, artificial intelligence, drone swarms, the development of autonomous weapon systems, the aftermath of the use of chemical weapons, Innu activism against the military exploitation of airspace, algorithmic injustice, expanding corporate and military interaction in contemporary warfare, the weaponization and militarization of outer space, nuclearism, global fatalities from pollution, the use of pesticides against Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, and evidence from people who have been subjected to aerial violence, including Omar Mohammed, who we'll hear speak later in a part of a video work that I'm going to play. He was known as the blogger Mosul Eye, who was reporting on the Battle of Mosul. He spoke about the dehumanization of civilians as collateral damage in the Battle of Mosul. Adel al-Mantari, sole survivor of a US drone strike on civilians in Yemen, spoke about that experience, and Abra Mechmechia spoke about the long-term psychological impacts on children and young people of the war in Aleppo. These, in particular, were absolutely critical and of critical importance to the development of the proposed new human right. So we have heard from over 70 people at those hearings in London, Toronto, Sydney, and Berlin, and also at round tables that engaged the military, policymakers, and NGOs, and workshops such as a recent one held in partnership with the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights here in Berlin to consider the proposed new human right in the context of the war in Ukraine that happened in November last year. So I'm working with Renata Seletzel, Andrew Hoskins, Anthony Downey here, and a growing international network of people, organizations, and institutions to prepare the proposed new human right for submission to the United Nations, Council of Europe, and other bodies. And this submission will include the double special issue of the Journal of Digital War that Jutta mentioned, which was published this year and has 28 contributions, and very importantly, it has contributions from people who have that experience of violence from above, as well as many other people who gave evidence at the tribunals, and it includes very important papers by Lisa Ling and Jutta Weber. And we also have lawyers and policy experts working now on in-depth legal and policy briefs on the proposed new human right. And I should say that one of the really important things about arguing for a standalone right is to force those conversations, is to raise the visibility and the incredible vulnerability, the mass vulnerability globally to the developments, these rapid developments, colonization and expansion and militarization of airspace and outer space, and those compounding threats. So just to talk about art practice and culture, I'm an artist. The Airspace Tribunal is closely interconnected to this large body of work called Topologies of Air, and this is a central part of it. It's an immersive, multi-screen, multi-channel sound installation. And it brings the voices from the Airspace Tribunal's conversations with survivors. For instance, I spent a lot of time in Hiroshima. So there are people who talk about the long-term impact of nuclear weapons, of the use of the atomic bomb there. And it includes archived material and film shot in places in many parts of the world. And it sets out to address the politics of scale, to challenge military abstraction, and to articulate the deep cultural histories, complexity, and compounding threat of the sky, and the compounding threats that impact the atmosphere and space above us. And so in the film you hear about the early fantasies of flight. You know, when technology allowed people into the air, there were these fantasies that people would be free. They would leave the kind of, the hell on earth, and they would go into this clear and open atmosphere. And you also hear from the survivors, as I said, of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima. You hear about the military exploitation of the electromagnetic spectrum, transboundary pollution, light pollution, and loss of access to the sky, the weaponization of outer space, and you also hear about people making a case for decolonizing the sky. And just as a very quick example of the many scalar interactions that cross throughout the work, there is perhaps a good example of this is a description of the complex interaction of radioactive materials, nutrients, and chemicals on fine particles that fill the air and form increasingly large dust storms in the Gulf region due to climate change and the war that has polluted, toxified, and broken the ground in Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria. And you also hear in the work quotes from various people, including one here from Svetlana Alexievich, who describes the nuclear catastrophe as a catastrophe of time. So you can see this is a very sort of large body of work. This is an image from Les Abattoirs Museum in Toulouse. And this is an image of a big wallpaper piece that is at the power plant in Toronto. And just to say that that all of the exhibitions are accompanied by people's assemblies, public events, workshops, reading rooms that are integral to the practice and to the wider project and to engagement in these discussions and debates. And a solo exhibition, the next exhibition, it's a touring exhibition, will open at Sukrana, Contemporary Art Gallery in Ljubljana in Slovenia in January 2025. And this is the book that Jutta mentioned. And it contains, I raise it because it contains a very important essay by Nick Grief that provides the legal outline for the proposed new human right. So, not yet, oops. Since establishing the Airspace Tribunal in 2018, we have seen the compounding and reverberating effects of wide area aerial bombardment, drone strikes, and other forms of aerial violence targeted at civilians and civilian infrastructure. And these have been exacerbated, as we have heard today and yesterday, by the unparalleled pace of technological developments in perpetual surveillance, autonomous weapons systems, or greater autonomy in weapon systems, and the deployment of largely unaccountable AI-powered targeting systems. And what I want to say here is that this is creating new patterns of terror, displacement, death, and intergenerational trauma. And the objectification of civilians as collateral damage excludes the long-term reverberating effects of civilian harm, while further adding to the psychological damage. The dehumanization of civilians is further exacerbated and accelerated through the development of greater machine autonomy in warfare. And the psychological and physiological impact on civilians, alongside new types of suffering that they now experience in the context of contemporary warfare and mass violence, is often long-lasting, traumatically intrusive, and transgenerational, but it remains persistently unacknowledged in legal, moral, and political terms. Civilians in war zones, subjected to drone warfare and aerial bombardment, suffer unrelenting anticipatory anxiety, as they are reminded of deaths and injury in previous strikes, or are terrorized by the fear of predictive targeting errors. As Catherine Loveday's evidence at the Airspace Tribunal highlighted, the psychological impact of these threats is often worse when the threat is unseen, and children are especially vulnerable to this. And the associated physiological harm is immense. It includes the inability to reproduce new cells, the inability to digest food properly, to sleep, and to maintain cognitive function. So the impact, therefore, is not only at the physical level, but also the physiological, the psychological, the social, the cultural, the environmental, and economic levels, often with mass vulnerability to displacement, starvation, long-term instability, and mental harm. And an understanding of the escalating vulnerabilities also requires an interrogation of the history of conflict and war, the legacies of colonialism, and the pathologies of identity-based violence. With the alarming acceleration in the use of artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making in the identification of increasingly large numbers of human targets, researchers have found that the signature patterns of life used to predict the likelihood of a person of being a combatant or a threat also resemble the survival behavior of civilians. And based on projections of threat, as Anthony is now going to discuss, aerial technology is occupying the future of civilian life, effectively extending the psychic imprisonment and trauma experienced by large populations also into the future. Before handing over to Anthony, I'd just like to play a short clip from a series of artworks that have also been made alongside Topologies of Air, which bring these voices into the public realm. And it's a piece actually of evidence that Anthony gave on the neocolonialism of AI-targeted warfare. Thank you.
Since at least the 18th century, the Middle East has been the object of the Western gaze and the subject of ideologically biased systems of representation. Whereas colonization was largely concerned with wealth extraction through occupation, neocolonization is largely concerned with data extraction through surveillance. However, there is a further twist. This data is used to better train autonomous weapon systems and predictive drone technologies to target, if not predetermine, those considered a threat. We enter here into a digital mise en abîme, an apparatus of digital mirroring, wherein which those who are subjected to surveillance provide data to ensure further improvements in those exact systems of surveillance. We need, through human rights discourse, to disrupt this recursive continuum of image production and application. It is through such an investigation that we could definitively trace a clear lineage from the physical and psychical violence wrought by colonialism and the equally physical and psychical violence of applied data in a neo-colonial age.
Thank you, Shona, and thank you to Tatiana and Jutta for the invitation to speak. It's a pleasure to be here. So, the clip you just saw was part of an evidence that I gave for the 2021 Airspace Tribunal in Toronto. And obviously, a lot has changed in those 3 years since. There's been a lot of developments in AI, there's been a lot of developments in artificial weapon systems. There's also been some developments in legislation, and to my mind at least, these particular developments in legislation have largely failed to fully comprehend or explain artificial intelligence and its impact and use in warfare. And more specifically, I think there are 3 areas that this legislation fails to address. I could list 20, but I'm going to list 3 today, and I'm going to make my comments brief about them. First thing it doesn't address is the historical function and historical context of AI. What was AI designed to do in the first place? Second thing that often gets elided is the operative logic of artificial intelligence. What does AI do in warfare? Thirdly, often fails to address the systemic functioning of AI. How does AI do what it does? Now again, these are relatively simple areas, relatively straightforward areas, but a lot of legislation, to my mind at least, still fails to deal with the reality of artificial intelligence, its systemic, operative functioning. So I want to just take that for a bit of a walk here today in the time that I have, and just explain what I mean by it. And I do this in the spirit of the work that we're doing with the Airspace Tribunal and that Shona has encouraged from the outset. And that is to develop fit-for-purpose methodologies for thinking from within these apparatuses, rather than merely representing or indeed reflecting upon them. Now again, the development of fit-for-purpose interdisciplinary methodologies I think is absolutely critical to the future of these debates. I want to be clear, when I talk about artificial intelligence, and as I speak about it today, I'm referring strictly to deep learning, machine learning, and the use of artificial neural networks in computer vision. Again, artificial neural networks being the basis of the computer vision systems that are being consistently utilized in automated weapon systems. So, Legislation. I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that the first UN resolution on lethal autonomous weapons was adopted in December of 2023. That's less than 1 year ago, basically. This document is an interesting document in and of itself. It's 3 pages, very simple to read. It mentions meaningful human control, human in the loop, and explainable AI throughout. The second document, however, which was a document published after this, the interim document of August 2024, which was published 4 months ago, is a more interesting document in many ways. Why? Because over its duration of 200 pages repeatedly refers to human in the loop, meaningful intervention, and explainable AI, as if somehow this is a deus ex machina figure that will appear, swoop down, and eradicate all of the problems that we have with artificial intelligence and automated weapons systems. I would suggest that in many ways that's a fallacy. The human in the loop is a fallacy, and this has been brought up repeatedly by Lucy, by Jutta, by Elka, and yesterday by Naomi and by Lisa as well. But it's a very dangerous fallacy because it fails to address quite a number of very, very straightforward elements in the function of artificial intelligence itself. To all intents and purposes, what we're dealing with, despite comments from Antonio Guterres, who, at the end of this report, Antonio Guterres being the United Nations Secretary General, he says the following: the automation of targeting of humans by machines is a moral line that should not be crossed. I would argue today that moral line has been crossed repeatedly, again and again and again. To substantiate this, we need to examine the following. Firstly, the historical evolution of artificial intelligence. Elke started with a discussion about Norbert Wiener. If you go back prior to the so-called Dartmouth workshop of 1956 and start looking at the evolution of AI, you very quickly come across Norbert Wiener's work. Norbert Wiener's work around automated systems was very much focused upon the notion of recursion. How can automated systems usurp the function of human activity and replicate it ad infinitum? Wiener, to his credit, realizes the impact and the potential ramifications of this, and in fact withdraws a lot of his research from the United States military. We should be looking at the work of Claude Shannon, specifically Claude Shannon's work around information theory, which focuses down on the so-called bits and the idea that machines will replicate and produce information for other machines that cut human involvement out of the loop. This is the basis of what we now understand today to be computer and computer technology. We could equally look at a very important paper of 1943, which I'm sure members of the audience are familiar with. And that paper is the paper that was published by Warren McCullough and Walter Pitts. I'll give you the full title because it's worth mentioning the full title of it, if indeed I can find it. I had it earlier. Yeah. It's a very important seminal paper. If you're not familiar with it, I'm sure you would benefit from it. Published in 1943, its title in full is A Logical Calculus of Ideas Imminent in Nervous Activity. Extraordinary article, because what they do in that particular text is offer up, despite the dry title of the text, they offer up a mathematical calculus of human cognition, but they also develop something else. It's called the perceptron algorithm. The perceptron algorithm is precisely what Frank Rosenblatt adopts for the perceptron, which is the machine, in 1958. This is the first known example of an automated imaging system operating through artificial neural networks. It's precisely that system that's adopted by the US Navy and the US military and the US Air Force in the evolution of its own AI systems. Specifically, today, the use of convolutional neural networks in automated weapon systems. The deployment, my apologies. All these systems, if you go back and look at the historical context, are explicitly concerned not just with augmenting human cognition, but in time, fully automating it. It's no mistake that there's an article and talk by Warren McCullough that has the following title: The Predetermined Human Machine, Thoughts as Burdens. And this was published in 1967. Through the distribution of agency and responsibility, AI is primarily designed to automate, not augment human cognition. This is all the more evident in warfare. The the questionable justification that AI merely augments human decision-making in automated weapons systems needs to consider the distributed levels of agency involved in these apparatuses, something that Eric touched off earlier. The distributed, diffused, mechanically usurped agency of human operators, the apparent safeguard afforded by the human in the loop, offers nothing more than a compromised model of oversight. And this is regardless of anything that the recent UN resolution, which is Resolution 78/241, has put forward. More worryingly, the human-in-the-loop defense can be arguably understood as a framework that normalizes the use of AI in warfare without offering much by way of commensurate and consequential safeguards for civilians and non-civilians alike. When it comes to making decisions and taking actions that usurp rather than incorporate human agency, the deterministic and compliant affordances of AI assume an agentic impetus. Or to put it another way, AI simulates an operational agency that appropriates or relegates meaningful human intervention. This has always been explicit in the evolution of artificial intelligence. Let's think about this operational agency briefly. The underlying principle of anticipation or prediction is foundational to the operative logic of AI. The military rationale of a preemptive strike is predicated upon the calculation and anticipation of threat. The deployment of predictive, algorithmically driven models of preemptive targeting in automated weapon systems would therefore appear to be all but inevitable. However, the fatal interlocking of martial paradigms of preemption and algorithmic models of predictive analysis needs to be understood. Let me start again. However, the fatal interlocking of martial paradigms of preemption and algorithmic models of predictive analysis needs to be questioned insofar as the irreparable decisiveness of a preemptive military strike is invariably at odds with the probabilistic predictions of AI. Let's consider this from another angle. The apparatus of AI seeks to not only anticipate but predetermine our realities. It seeks to occupy the future. In warfare, AI seeks out potential threats, real or imagined, to destroy them. Established through the statistical rationalizations of data, going back to Juta's earlier points, artificial intelligence therefore produces structures and categories of epistemic violence, potential threat, to justify the event of actual violence, that is, the eradication of threat. And I'll give you an example here. The last known drone strike in Afghanistan occurred on August 29th, 2021. That drone strike was delivered by an MQ-9 Reaper drone, and it was a Hellfire missile. It was fired into the compound of Zamari Ahmadi in the Khoya Burja region of southern Kabul. The Hellfire missile killed Zamari Ahmadi, his brother-in-law, and 8 children. At the time, it was registered as a righteous strike by the US military. It later transpired that Zamari Ahmadi was an aid worker and that his pattern of life, his pattern of survival, had been misconstrued and algorithmically rationalized as a pattern of threat. A pattern of daily civilian survival involving the delivery of aid can, through an algorithmically sanctioned prediction of threat, become a death sentence. The extraction of civilian patterns of life in these contexts becomes a pretext for targeting entire populations, going back to Shona's point earlier. The outcome of this is stark. Through machinic automation and computational projection, the legal definition of discrimination and proportionality in warfare is being repeatedly flouted, if not entirely abrogated. In these contexts, the reciprocal relationship between the objectives of preemptive warfare, technological automation, and the affordances of AI not only challenges but radically reconfigures the very meaning of the term civilian through the systemic functioning of algorithms. Very briefly, and I'll finish up on this, talking about the systemic functioning of algorithms and computational projection. The deployment of artificial intelligence in contemporary warfare routinely mobilizes specters of threat that provide the rationale for preemptive strikes. In an algorithmic era, the computational projection of enduring threat, the summoning fort of risk, provides a rationalization for the automation of killing and the prosecution of so-called perpetual wars. The systemic functioning of an algorithm, if weighted accordingly, can be all too readily produce or all too readily render a computational abstraction real. Through the weightings applied to data, algorithms calibrate certain projections in order to proclaim them indisputable rather than, as they are, provisional and contingent. To this end, AI in the service of automated weapons systems can actualize the very event, that is threat, that they were designed to predict. However, what if these computational specters of threat are precisely that? Phantasms of probable threat that appears to be always on the horizon, always impending, always there, but nevertheless indefinitely out of sight, but not, crucially, out of the range of algorithmically defined calculations of risk. Let's break this down briefly. Algorithms mistake existing patterns of activity and produce erroneous predictions. These are often called hallucinations, but make no mistake, they are not hallucinations. They are errors in the predictive analysis that are systemic and endemic to algorithms. You only have to look at the susceptibility of convolutional neural networks to so-called fooling images or adversarial images to see this. We could also, for example, discuss, as Jack Polson does in recent work, the use of large language models in generative AI, or for the purpose of generative AI, in automated weapons systems. Through redistributing human agency across multiple platforms and networks, automated weapons systems optimize prophecies or phantasms of unending menace. Paranoid projections of threat can be readily encoded into the operative systemic logic of AI and its weightings or threshold values. These threshold values can in turn recalibrate the threshold between life and death. Political and martial paranoia can be, likewise, programmed into algorithmic rationalizations of threat, summoning forth perpetual risk in the name of unending war. Finally, if the prospect of automated models of death has indeed become exemplary rather than exceptional, we need to consider the degree to which the provisional rationalization of AI targeting systems has effectively recalibrated, through models of digital dehumanization, the legal thresholds that define the distinction between a civilian and a so-called non-civilian. If we are witnessing the delegation of life and death decisions to a mechanical calculus of probability, then we must therefore ask, in parting, whether AI is generating a model of digital dehumanization in the pursuit of automated annihilation. I'll pass back to Shona.
Thank you very much, Anthony. So I'm going to be very brief. I just want to end by saying that we suggest collectively from the Airspace Tribunal that we need to refocus and reimagine civilian protection in the public, political, legal, and military imaginations. We need to instigate new forms of protection of human life and environments from these escalating and exacerbated threats that we are seeing in 21st century war. The development of automated weapon systems and mass atrocity. And that this requires the development and strengthening of human rights dimension of airspace and outer space, not just for current, but also for future generations. And on that note, we would like to end on a very, very short clip, again by historian Omar Mohammed, who I mentioned earlier was the blogger Mosul Eye, who reported from the ground during the Battle of Mosul in 2016 to 2017. Thank you.
Yes, we are afraid of the sky. We are still afraid of looking at the sky because we don't know what might come from there. The children who lived during that time, who have been traumatized, are still unable to dare to look at the sky. many of the philosophers. And the early philosophy was only developed when the philosophers were able to look at the sky and to start their imagination. Imagine what damage such fear of the sky would do to the generations yet to come. The damage that such airstrikes do to the people is not just losing your house. It's not just losing your beloved ones. You lose forever your dignity for a reason. You don't know who killed you. Who is going to bring justice for those victims? Who is going to count those names? Who is going to mention those names? No one.
Thank you very much, Shona and Anthony. This was a very important moment as well to understand also how to work with the discourse of visualization of evidence and to understand also the threats from the sky and from above. That is a very important component of the kill cloud. So thank you very much. And now I wanted to say that we will have a break of 20 minutes, so we will come back at 6:30. And please come back because it will be a very important panel about Gaza. And we will speak about facial recognition, automated surveillance, and also AI and warfare. So please come back at 6:30 and see you later.